critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, hello and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers. Here on the Muckrakers, we always pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is to provide more light and less heat in our unwavering quest to uncover the truth and to inform, educate and entertain with dignity and indeed respect. And it's vital that we don't just ask the questions, but we question those answers. Well, today we're going to be talking about the erosion of free speech and how to survive the current threats. It was Evelyn Beatrice Hall, one of the most misquoted quotes ever. She was a friend of Voltaire, not Voltaire themselves, say, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Well, never has there been a more threatening time about free speech than what's going on at the moment. To discuss all of that and a lot more, and it's me, Andrew Eborn, together with my very good friends, Martin J. and Dr. George Szamuely. Welcome back to you both, gentlemen.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
Now, Dr. George Szamuely, I always say this, is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute, London. He's written for innumerable publications and is author of a book that everybody's got at least 2 copies of by now, Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. And he is perhaps the only person I've managed to interview around the world, and boy, have I done a few of them, who's actually probably read every single one of the books behind him. Is that right, George?
More or less.
More or less. Most people just have it for decoration, which is glorious. Yeah. But more or less is good. We read most of them. Martin J is an award-winning journalist, editor of Margrebi.org and Levantis.me. His impressive career has spanned over 30 years, which has seen him work in over 50 countries for a host of big media titles. Now, on his webpage, he says it's a wonderful quote from CNN, "A good journalist, but a pain in the backside." A lot of people have pointed out they've missed the irony of all of this. Because to be a good journalist, you need to be a pain in the backside, don't you? Martin?
That's it. And it's so sad that we have to explain that. You know, I think journalists 30 years ago would never have said that. So the world's changing, unfortunately, and we're all getting old and we're not really adapting. You know, it's all getting harder, isn't it, Andrew?
Well, I'm not getting older. You can speak for yourself. I feel younger every time I do this show. But it is important. You've got to keep asking those questions. And yes, of course, that will make you a pain in the backside of some. But we need to keep holding people's feet to the fire. And that's what we do here on the Muckrakers. Now, before we get into this big discussion about free speech, I want to talk about the latest government news. The UK government saying that staff are working around the clock to plan for all scenarios to keep British nationals safe as tensions are growing between Iran and Israel amid fear of an attack. And the UK government, they're preparing emergency evacuations for British nationals. There are apparently around 60,000 British nationals currently in Israel. And the Foreign Office advised against all non-essential travel to Israel and has urged Brits in Lebanon to leave. Now, there's an expectation that Iran will retaliate following the killing of Hamas, although I see just reported that Joe Biden has said they will not attack if ceasefire is agreed. What's your take on that, George?
Well, it seems very strange that it's taken all this time to start talking about evacuations. We've been expecting some form of an attack for quite a while. And to be honest, the longer we wait, I think the less likely that the attack will take place, because now American and Western assets are in place. The Americans are there. They've already made clear that they're going to, quote, defend, unquote, Israel. And that means that the British are going to be there. Starmer has already made clear he's going to be involved. The French are probably going to be involved in the usual cast of suspects. Jordan will be involved. So the likelihood of an Iranian attack, I think, greatly diminishes. And to be fair, Iran is really between a rock and a hard place, because if Iran doesn't do anything, then it's seen to be weak, ineffectual, a paper tiger. If it does launch an attack, then, again, if it's seen to be just a pro forma, and I think at this stage it is going to be pro forma. There's so many Western assets are in place that it's unlikely that too many missiles will get through the Western defenses. So it's a pro forma. If, however, it decides to go all in, then it is the bad guy, and therefore it'll be the green light for the West to go to war against Iran, and Iran just simply isn't strong enough to take the West on. So it's in a very difficult position. I suspect, going back to your comment about President Biden, is Iran is hoping that some kind of a deal will be worked out, and then that would be its walk-off ramp. Oh, well, we didn't retaliate because we didn't want to jeopardize the ceasefire talks.
Yeah, and it is interesting because it was the 31st of July, some time ago, 2 weeks ago, that obviously the chief negotiator for a peace settlement, the Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh, he was assassinated in Tehran. I find the whole thing extraordinary when he was, as I say, key to the peace negotiations. What's your take on it, Martin?
I do broadly agree with what George said. I think the longer it goes on like this, the harder it will be for an Iranian strike. I mean, the Iranians, they are between a rock and a hard place. As George says, they're really stuck. They need political capital to satisfy their people after these attacks on their own shores, in their own country. But by the same token, they don't want a war. They don't want a war with the West. It's just too beyond the pale. It's just too huge to contemplate, to take in. And I think what we're seeing now, I mean, I think the announcements which we're hearing now about the British arranging for the subjects to be evacuated from Israel and from Lebanon as well. They're talking about a sort of Dunkirk-style rescue on the beaches of southern Lebanon. This shows that they are not really very serious. They don't take the Iranian threat seriously themselves. But what we're seeing is, I think, we're getting to a dangerous situation where both sides believe the sheer amount of muscle that they can bring into the room should diffuse the tensions and get both sides to back down concurrently. And I think that's a pretty dangerous way of thinking, because I don't think that will necessarily work with the Iranians. They push themselves into a corner where they have to make some sort of geo-military statement and strikes, even though I've said I don't believe they will carry out huge strikes on Israel's on mainland Israel. I've said that before. I don't think they will do that. But I think this story is interesting because I think we're not being told the whole picture. And I wonder if there is a lot of politics in the background and back-channel discussions between Iran and the Americans. I wonder if Joe Biden is actually trying to mastermind this so that he can pull off a ceasefire. I mean, everybody backs down, and the real political winners are Biden and Iran, and to some extent Israel, because at least Israel gets out of the tight position it's in now. But the Iranians are laughing. I mean, they're laughing all the way to the bank, because every single day that passes, they see the desperation and the panic setting in Israel, and they see the economy tumbling as well. So they are playing it quite cool. It seems, until something decisive happens, this is a game that I think they believe that they are winning at so far. But as I say, I don't think we have all the information. I think we're being shortchanged by mainstream media, and I think there's something bigger going on there, which we'll find out about hopefully in a few days' time.
You're absolutely right, and I always say we're never given the full picture, and I think there's so often the media is played, if you like. You get these little sound bites. An Iranian president, he says that he has the legitimate right to retaliate against Israel's cowardly assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran in late July. It is interesting, though, and I think that Biden, he wants this, doesn't he, as a legacy, to turn around and say, well, he's sorted this out. Otherwise, Trump will come trumpeting in and saying, well, he'll sort it out with a couple of phone calls. And that's done. Is that a fair summary, do you think, George?
Well, I think it's a fair summary that it may be what Biden is thinking, but he's not going to have a legacy, because it was on his watch that this terrible war has taken place, and he's going to have to live with the responsibility for this slaughter. And let's remember that only yesterday was announced a $20 billion package for Israel after all the talk from the Biden administration that, boy, we're really, really unhappy with Netanyahu. He's a real, pain in the backside, as you put it, Andrew.
Yes.
So, we've just about had it with him. And then, here's another 20 billion, do what you want with it. So I think Biden is not going to be well regarded in the history books. But there is also another aspect for Iran. I mean, let's remember when Iran received much worse humiliations in the past. I mean, it had General Soleimani assassinated while he was on a peace mission. He was a national hero, a senior figure within the Iranian leadership. And essentially, Iran was allowed to do a kind of a pro forma attack on an empty American barracks in Iraq. And then, of course, we had the attack on these Iranian generals in an Iranian consulate. So those were direct attacks on Iran, and Iran made a pro forma strike. In this case, while the attack took place on Iranian territory, it wasn't an Iranian who was killed. It was a Hamas leader who was killed. So that allows Iran to say, well, we're not going to risk a war. We're not going to risk destruction of our country for the sake of a Palestinian leader. I mean, it may have taken place on our territory, but this isn't a sufficient cause for us to get into a war that we can't win. So if it had been an Iranian leader who had been executed, then I think it would be a bit different. But I think because of that, because it's a Palestinian leader, that gives Iran, an off-ramp, as well as the argument that, hey, we don't want to do anything to jeopardize the ceasefire talks.
Martin?
Yeah, I think he's nailed it. And I think this is probably the scenario that's going to play out now in the next few days, how to diffuse this situation and gradually walk away from it. But I think George is right about Biden, though. Biden has left this diabolical legacy in the Middle East, and he won't want Trump to swoop in and do what Trump always does, which is present himself as the sole solution to everything, and to fix it with a few phone calls or a couple of high-profile meetings. So we're living in really scary times, though. The real worry in these situations is miscalculation. And if you look at America and NATO's record just recently, just in the last couple of years in Ukraine, it's been nothing but miscalculation. Every single turning point of that war has been a failure of policy and a miscalculation on NATO's part. So we have to worry that the Americans aren't going to slip up and just misinterpret something. I'm thinking 1988 in the summer, an Iranian airliner going across the Persian Gulf that was shot down by the American destroyer, and it turned out to be an airliner full of well over 250 civilians. This is the kind of thing that we really should worry about, and I would put money more on the Americans messing up than on the Iranian side. The other factor is that we should consider is that the stakes is much higher than ever before, because we're looking at now what is looking increasingly as a world war scenario. I mean, Iran is not on its own now. There's been reports in the last few days that Russia is deploying a lot of its own heavy equipment within Iran to support the Iranians. So you've got, a sort of a Iran plus, you almost got, you could say, sort of the BRICS giants, Iran and Russia together facing Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is in the middle. And so we hope that things can be cool, but who can step in? Who has that political dynamism? Who has that charisma? Who can actually jet in and cool everything down? Emmanuel Macron? I don't think so. Sir Keir Starmer, give me a break. There's just no one else there, unfortunately.
Well, interesting. They're talking about Sir Keir Starmer and give me a break. Well, break is upon us. See what a lovely segue there is there. And Nigel Farage, he slammed Keir Starmer as the biggest threat to free speech. We're going to discuss all that next. Don't touch that dial.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers here on TNT. And we always love little chats in between. We've got Murray in the studio today talking about scorpions, which and Martin was saying he learned so much from the Muckrakers, not least that they have scorpions in Australia. One thing they also have in Australia is free speech, but that's being eroded not just there, but around the world. And Nigel Farage, he slammed Keir Starmer, wonderful headline, grabbing stuff. He says Keir Starmer is the biggest threat to free speech in British history. Is he right, George?
I think he is. I think Starmer has always been an authoritarian. He was even an authoritarian during the COVID hysteria. He was among the worst of the purveyors of the COVID hysteria, and therefore he was all for stamping out what he called and what people like him called disinformation, but which has turned out to be correct information. And so Starmer has seized on the recent disturbances to crack down on free speech. So he wasn't content which simply to send to prisons people who didn't, throw a brick here or, set fire to something else, use violence, because that's boring. I mean, the courts automatically send people like that to prison or whatever. He went after the purveyors of disinformation. So he immediately went after the social media company, as he always intended to do. And now he is advocating essentially within the schools a kind of a brainwashing operation within all of the schools inside the UK to stamp out all kinds of wrong think that he's against. Now, what's also interesting in the UK is how the justice system, I mean, we're supposed to be a democracy, therefore we have an independent judiciary. And yet we see that the courts are acting entirely on the orders of the government, which is quite unheard of, because the courts are supposed to be independent. So people are being pushed into the courts, they get arrested, sent to go before a judge, they plead guilty, and they're immediately in prison. And that's swift justice. The media are, of course, approving of this. But it, again, shows that in Starmer's Britain, there isn't even the minimum of legal protections. I mean, even in the old Soviet Union, there was at least a step-by-step process, arrest, arraignment, you have a chance to talk to your defense counsel. You don't go straight, from the street and into prison for quite substantial prison terms. But Starmer, as I say, isn't going to leave it at that. Starmer is going to go after the influencers, because that's who he is. He's somebody who's in the business of stamping out ideas that he hates, and he's not going to let this go.
Yeah. Martin?
Yeah, I never thought I'd be asked to comment on Nigel Farage and free speech. I don't think Nigel Farage really likes free speech so much. I don't see him as a sort of example to hold up. In Brussels, I had an investigative magazine which I kept going for 4 years, and Nigel didn't particularly like it, and he didn't cooperate with it at all. And after 2 years, he offered a job to my partner to become a UKIP press officer, which basically put the magazine out of business. And then after that, I got no cooperation at all from Nigel and UKIP. Sort of blacklisted the magazine, had nothing to do with me. So I don't know if. Here's the takeaway. I've been a journalist for 33 years or something, and I've been sued more times for defamation than I can remember. And I'll tell you about free speech. Let me tell you about free speech. 99% of people who bang on about free speech are bullshit. Really. Most people who go on about free speech don't believe in it themselves. It's one of these subjects which is just rank with hypocrisy. And I don't think Nigel's an exception. He won't be very happy with me saying that. When you get sued, a number of times that I've been sued through UK defamation court by MEPs for investigating their corruption or their dirty deals, and you don't even get a chance to defend yourself because the system is stacked up so much against you. Because as you know, in UK defamation law, it's all really about money, how deep your pockets are, So free speech, it's funny how 99% of people who bang on about free speech are not at all interested in free speech at all. They just use it as a sort of veneer as a sort of gauntlet to throw down and promote themselves. But, what they really mean is, I really believe in free speech as long as it's within the confines of my own political ideas and my friends and such forth. But as soon as we go beyond those boundaries, then I don't want free speech at all, and I want to sort of retract everything I said about free speech. I think the biggest hypocrite in British politics is probably Neil Kinnock for this. Who sued me and sued Private Eye for an awful lot of money when I had a column in Private Eye when I supposedly defamed him. Another person who bangs on a lot about free speech, but as that classic quote in Dad's Army, they don't like it up 'em. When free speech goes against you, then it becomes a very different thing. So free speech for me is something which is absolutely dripping in hypocrisy. Hardly anybody really believes in it. Hardly anybody really cares. When I almost went to prison in Belgium for exposing the paedophile ring, I had a writ served at my present premises in my office. I had a high court judgment made against me in the evening, at night, in my absence. It was faxed to me at 9:15 the following morning, and then the phone just rang off the hook because of Belgian journalists trying to do an assassination job on me. All about free speech, trying to report. I think when we think about what's happening in Britain right now is very worrying. We have the slow erosion of people's freedom to speak. I mean, freedom of speech for me is about total liberty, is about the real essence of democracy. Freedom of speech is ugly. Freedom is ugly. And people don't realize that. When people talk about freedom and freedom of speech, they don't realize that it's not limited. It has no boundaries. We used to have in London, you're old enough to remember, I think, Andrew, we used to have a place called Speaker's Corner, where people would stand. Is it still there? Does it still function?
Still there. And somebody, a Christian woman, was attacked by another group. It was in the papers just a few hours ago. So yes, it's still there, and people are still speaking their minds.
Wherever I've been around the world, in Africa and the Middle East, I always find educated people come up to me and ask me about Speaker's Corner, and they tell me this is something extraordinary about Great Britain. You have this place where people can stand on a soapbox and mutter absolutely anything. No matter how disgusting, no matter how vulgar, no matter how rude, no matter how irreverent, no matter how wrong. Because people in Britain used to believe in this idea that freedom of speech meant that you could really utter anything you wanted to, and it was important that you had the right to do that. I think, wasn't it Orwell who said, no, it wasn't Orwell. It was, I think, Chomsky who said something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, if we don't believe in free speech for the people we hate or despise, then we don't believe in it at all. And I think that's absolutely bang on the money. You've got to allow free speech for everybody. And no matter how disgusting or absurd or wrong people, talk, these people on the internet who have gone to prison in the UK, they're basically really simple people. Tracy from Stevenage, who gets on the internet and just rants a lot of racist nonsense about Muslims. What we should be asking ourselves, what we should be worried about, is that when she goes to prison for 20 months or whatever it was, we should be asking ourselves, is there a price that comes with free speech? Because free speech actually isn't free, and when people start to try and control free speech, and Labour it's starting to get its tentacles in it now. When Labour will actually get into full swing, when Sir Keir Starmer actually starts to, have his way and start swiping and chopping away, huge swathes of liberties. When the blade comes down and it takes away people like Tracy from Stevenage with their stupid racist rants, what it also does is it takes away other people's perfectly salient political comments, which don't necessarily correspond with the power that is doing that particular action. And so what will happen is that we will see in future, some of this hate speech and racism. Many people will say it's a really good thing. We should do that. We shouldn't have hate speech. But I think the danger is when you cut away hate speech and you start putting people into prison, you also allow the state, the elite, to start using the same rules to actually shut people up who just have a narrative which conflicts with yours.
Yeah, and in fact, it was George Orwell. Everybody's got a quote on freedom of speech. He was the one who said freedom is the right to tell people what they don't want to hear. That's right. That George Orwell saying that sort of stuff. But you're right. I always say it's freedom of speech, but not always freedom from consequences. So if you say something which is defamatory, basically then you will end up in court. And that's the front and center of what happens with Tommy Robinson. And there's that classic cartoon from a brilliant artist called J. Bright from the 18th century, which depicts a cow with the word litigation written on it. And the plaintiff is pulling the horns of the cow, and the defendant is pulling the tail, and the lawyer's in the middle milking the cow, because the only people who benefit from litigation are the lawyers. But the best defense for defamation is the truth, which is why if you search for that sort of stuff, that's your best defense. But somebody who's a big advocate and always holds himself out as a big advocate is Elon Musk, and he's at war, if you like, with the British government over free speech. He's repeatedly calling Keir Starmer two-tier Keir about his policing methods and how you'll basically clamp down on people very, very quickly, get them into court within nanoseconds. But things like the Manchester airport troubles, which we had, where somebody was depicted stamping on somebody's head and there was a fighting with police officers and somebody got their nose broken, that's still waiting to be charged, as I understand it. What's your take on Elon, Martin? What's your take on him?
The same thing I said earlier about 99% of people who bang on about free speech, are basically BSing. I'm very skeptical. I'm very, very skeptical, because I've noticed that, he's really big on free speech, but he's also has his own politics. And if you notice, the people who he promotes, who he pushes on his own Twitter platform, tend to obviously be in line to his politics. So, I don't really buy it all. I don't believe it. I think it all stinks. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy there. It'd be interesting to see how, look, the other thing about free speech, and what we don't get from Elon Musk, what we don't get from Nigel Farage or any of these people who claim to believe in free speech, and this would be something that would appeal to you, Andrew, is we don't get any debate around defamation laws. There's no debate about the reform of defamation laws. If those people really cared about free speech, this would be one of their subjects. This would be one of their pet hates. I mean, Elon Musk, he seems obsessed with Britain. I mean, did he have an English girlfriend that dumped him or something? He really is obsessed with his country. And I know that the government is left wing and he's not left wing, and he probably doesn't like them. But he's just he seems to be carrying around some sort of grudge with him. I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical about everything he comes up with. We don't get a debate from him or any claims or any demands from him that defamation laws should be reformed. If people really care about freedom of speech, this would be the first port of call. In Britain, defamation law is heavily tilted towards people who've got deep pockets. So it doesn't even matter if you're right or you're wrong. If you're a politician and a journalist gets hold of some information about you and he publishes it, the first issue is, how do you shut this journalist up using your money? You go to your brief, and that journalist gets a writ, as I got many writs from MEPs, and 90%, if not 95% of the time, that does the job. Because the first question that you're going to find from a lawyer who's going to try and help you, when I was in London and I went to see Ian Hislop, and we worked out how we're going to deal with the Kinnock case, he sent me around to his Etonian brief around the corner, a very charming young man who chain smoked Rothmans, and said, "Have you got £20,000? And I said naively, "Is that how much it's going to cost?" And he said, "No, that's how much it's going to start at." So how do independent journalists, how with small magazines of low circulation, even big media, which is cash-strapped now, how do you deal with the Kinnock factor of people who understand defamation law and just manipulate it? And what happens, what I noticed in this scenario is that within seconds of talking to lawyers, nobody was interested in right or wrong. Nobody's interested in whether this information you've got has any validity at all. It's really about the money. And so, in America, it's slightly different. It's more draconian in America. If when you have a case of defamation in America, you as the plaintiff have to prove that the newspaper that's defamed you actually did it out of malice. So that takes it to the next level. It's one stage further, which makes defamation very, very hard in America, which is why, as you know, in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of defamation shopping. You had celebrities, big millionaire celebrities and rappers and movie stars in America would do their defamation courts in the UK system based on the fact that, they've been defamed on a global website, and the number of people in the UK who are reading it would therefore be affected by that reporting and damage to reputation. So I will take Elon Musk seriously and Nigel Farage seriously when they campaign for the reform of defamation law, and I'm not holding my breath.
Okay, very interesting points. And just in answer to your question, yes, Elon Musk, not only did he have a girlfriend, he had twice he was married to Tallulah Riley, who's a brilliant British actress. There we are. You'll remember she starred in Westworld and that stuff. Told you learned stuff on the Muckrakers.
You are an emporium of useless information, Andrew.
I thank you. There's so much more to come. George, what's your take, George, on Elon?
I think it's, frankly, I'm just... Elon Musk is the best we've got. I mean, I don't see any point in criticizing him now. I mean, you remember what Twitter was before he took it over. I mean, it was actually on a rampage of deplatforming people on one issue after another. Masses and masses of people were getting deplatformed. It deplatformed the incumbent president of the United States, as did Facebook. You had university professors, Stanford University professors like Jay Bhattacharya getting deplatformed for what they were saying on COVID. I mean, and then, if you were deemed to be an election denier, you got deplatformed. I mean, this was really something that you had the social media were all in the hands of kind of the liberal left. And they were absolutely cock-a-hoop about it because they said, yeah, this is it. We've got what we wanted. We're running these organizations, and we're just kicking off everybody whom we don't like. And then when and there was an alternative social media platform that came into being, tried to challenge Twitter, which is Parler, and boom, all the social media platforms got together. They formed a cabal and destroyed it. Just everyone, Amazon, Facebook, and all of them got together. Boom, they just destroyed it. So Musk, again, he's not perfect. We can certainly criticize him for, particularly on his stance on Israel. But it's there's no question. I think Twitter has improved immensely. And so then you have to ask, well, how come then he's now become the target? Why is he so targeted by British politicians? And the other day by Thierry Breton, the EU commissioner, who sent this letter. Imagine that. Yeah. He sends this letter, this threatening letter to Musk, just prior to his interview with Trump, and he's saying, well, of course, we all like freedom of speech. We believe strongly in free speech. However, you have to make sure that there is no harmful speech. You have to make sure there's no disinformation. You have to make sure that there isn't people aren't endangered in any way. In other words, I don't care whatsoever about free speech, though I pretend I do. I want to crack down on platforms that allow speech to take place that presents views that I don't like. And how do I get around it? I say, well, this is disinformation. Yeah. Now, of course, anyone who believes in free speech says, yeah, well, free speech means disinformation. Yeah, people can be wrong. That's what it is. Everyone makes mistakes. You can say things that happen to be wrong. But when you start throwing people off because of views that you don't like, then something else is going on. So we have these Labour MPs who say, yeah, well, free speech isn't hate speech. Well, it all depends on what hate speech is. I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, if you think people saying stuff that you don't like, that's hate speech. Well, okay, then that'd be hate speech. So we can outlaw all sorts of speech that we don't like. But of course, once you do that, then you have to wonder who is posting these things on social media, because once you created the situation where you can pressure social media companies by saying, hey, look, you've got all these neo-Nazi messages here. This is really bad. You're giving racists and Nazis and fascists a platform. Who's posting these things? These are all anonymous. And you think, well, we know that governments, we know about the 77th Brigade, they're sitting there, they're monitoring all these things, and they could well be posting these things precisely in order to discredit the social media companies. Oh, look at what's happened since Musk took over. Neo-Nazi tweets have multiplied, exponentially. Yeah, because there are people who are always doing this. They're always putting these things online in order to discredit a platform. I mean, like RT, which has now been banned in Europe, which again shows the free speech. You go down to look at the messages under any show, and it's all about Nazis, Hitler, the Jews. You think, why would people doing it? We have a discussion about Kazakhstan, and the messages are all about Nazis and Jews. So somebody's doing this. Somebody's doing this deliberately to discredit the social media companies. So that's really the problem here, is that there's now a powerful force. Keir Starmer, obviously, he's in power in the UK. You have these creatures like Thierry Breton in the EU. You've got the Digital Safety Act. I think that's the one in the EU. I think it's called the Digital Safety Act. They always want safety. We're trying to protect people. We're doing it for your good, protecting you. And then you have the Online Safety Act in the UK. I think they're gonna go and try to crack down as much as possible on social media and stamp out all the views that they don't like. And I think Musk is in the way, and that's why they're threatening him. I mean, the EU is really threatening him, and he could well be just altogether just banned from the EU. Could even be banned from the UK.
Yeah, you make some interesting points, and sometimes they call it a safety act. In other places, they've called it the Online Harms Act. The narrative is really important. One act which we had in 2023 was the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, and that was supposed to be becoming law, but all of a sudden, it's no longer going to happen. We're going to be discussing that straight after these messages.
You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, joined by Dr. George Szamuely and Martin J. And we're discussing, lucky that we still can, freedom of speech. We also talk about Elon Musk and just how productive he is. I was saying in the break that he's got at least 12 children by 3 different women. And one of his children, his son, it's called X. And that's part of the inspiration for the change of name for Twitter, which he bought for 44 billion. Education all the way. And talking of education, in 2023, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act became law. But basically, the government has turned around and said they're not going to enact it now. The implementation has been stopped, basically due to concerns about potential harm to student welfare. And the government has said they're not going to enforce the act and may consider actually repealing it. What the act did, it required universities, colleges and students' union in England to ensure lawful freedom of speech on campus, basically, and concerns arose about protecting hate speech and overlooking minority group safety and so on and so forth. And the OFS will now focus on financial security for universities rather than free speech. And I've been speaking to a number of people, including the alumni for free speech, brilliant people there. And they always quote Obama, who said, I don't agree that when you become students at college, you have to be coddled and protected from different points of view. Now, their take on this is like many others, and this is a quote from them, many others involved in trying to strengthen free speech at universities, AFFS was shocked by the new Secretary of State's actions. Given the obvious lack of substance in the reasons given, we can only assume that this act of legislative vandalism was motivated by petty political tribalism and a willingness to succumb to lobbying by self-interest university trade bodies, which had already resisted the legislation. It's an extraordinary step where you have legislation introduced, it even got royal assent, and they basically turn around and say they're not going to implement it. What's your take on this, Martin?
I'm flabbergasted. I mean, my view of British universities, I don't think it's been lower. I mean, they are just appalling bastions of wokeism, and the problem is you have this wokeism now, which is all over the place. And, the idea that you have freedom of speech in these places is just nonsense, absolutely nonsense. I mean, I have a number of interns from British universities who work for Levantis and for Maghrebi. And I was recently cancelled by Sheffield University because I had the audacity to tell one of my interns from Sheffield University that her work wasn't very good. And she took this rather badly and made a complaint against me and said that my mannerisms and the tone and how I communicated with her on WhatsApp was inappropriate. And, they had a huge row with the college dean on the subject, and they basically cancelled me and said, you can't talk to students like that. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you can't give them your opinion. We are supposed to praise them. We are supposed to lift them up and fill them with positive feeling. And this whole praise culture was explained to me, which seemed to me to be sort of some horrific kind of 1930s German Nazi sort of scenario where, you are basically controlled by the thought police. And so freedom of speech, British universities, I'm not swallowing it at all. I think that this is just nonsense. It seems to me that if you say this draft legislation was in the pipeline and it's just been spiked very recently, then I'm wondering whether this is focus groups that got involved and realized that it's just going to be, the basis of ridicule with the press. You said earlier about a cartoon. I've got a cartoon for you which I can't forget, and I remember this when I was being sued, when I was being had up by the Belgian state, who basically wanted to strip me of every asset I had and throw me in jail because I identified the people at the heart of the paedophile scandal. I remember I think it was Private Eye, who ran a cartoon of a very old high court judge in the UK, who looked a bit senile. As he was leaning over, he was pointing at somebody in the witness box, and he said, "Now we've heard all your views about free speech. Now shut up." And I think this is very symbolic really, of that sums it up, isn't it? Free speech is really a farce. No matter what level you take it at, it's just farcical. It's often a sort of raw material that politicians use basically to cultivate the parameters whereby they can actually control the flow of information and the narrative. And what George was saying earlier, is very worrying. In Europe and America, just about everywhere now, you're having these new digital safety kind of laws coming in, which have been dressed up as the big state protecting you, from disinformation. But the problem with that, of course, is that we know from history that when governments have the opportunity to manipulate information via the press, whether we want to talk about the two Gulf Wars, where they totally controlled the narrative and more or less invented this phrase, fake news. We know that governments can't be trusted, and the EU certainly can't be trusted to be that policeman. Do we need a policeman at all? The interesting thing I think also wanted to point out is that this idea that we need protecting from the ugly side of free speech. Okay, we had in the UK a few people who made some racist comments and incited hatred. And a lot of sensible people would say something needs to be done about that. But the problem is no one has the answer, because the problem is that the internet is really a feral beast. And it's one of the beauties, the success of the internet, the success of social media is that it is that feral and uncontrolled and, really out of control in many ways. And I think 20, 30 years ago, we were smarter, we were more astute, we were more politically aware. We basically had more common sense. And I would blame this new situation we've got. If we are to believe the politicians who say to us, look, you need protecting. You need protecting from Tracy and Stevenage with her racist rants. If we do, then I think we have to blame the big state, the deep state, for nannying us for the last 30 or 40 years. I don't live in the UK, but the last time I came to London, I almost wet myself laughing because I came in summer, got on the tube at London Airport, Heathrow, and as I was getting into London, as it came out of the tunnel and sunshine hit the compartment, there was this very old Etonian BBC recording which came on, which said, in this sort of weather, it's advisable to carry a bottle of water with you. And I'm looking at people in front of me, and we're all laughing. And I'm thinking, what happened to my country? How stupid did we become where we need to be treated like 5-year-olds. And the bigger question is, was that part of a bigger plan by the elites to treat us like 5-year-olds so that we can say at a later point, you need now protecting. You need protecting from scorching weather in July, which you didn't plan for, and you're not clever enough to work out to bring a bottle of drinking water with you. You need protecting from this swathe of information on the internet, which you're not educated to understand or process. I think this is all really very, very Orwellian. Orwell must be really laughing his socks off now at all this, because so much of what he's predicted seems to have come true. And this. George is right about Elon Musk. I do appreciate the point he's making. He's saying Elon Musk is really all we've got against this, against the wokeism, against big state taking control. But there are other, I think, bigger questions we need to be asking. One of the things that distinguished the part of the world I'm in now, and Europe and in Britain, is that the sad thing, terribly sad thing, is in a lot of Arab countries I've worked in, is that we don't even have freedom of speech. Worse than that, we don't have freedom of thought. People do not feel as though they're able to even entertain various political ideas or discussions when you meet educated people, in perfectly amiable environment. People can't actually, they don't have the freedom of thought. They haven't had it for decades. And so before you have freedom of speech, you need freedom of thought. And what I'm seeing in Arab countries, whereby people cannot get into a discussion with you because they don't have the experience of thinking outside of the box. They've been taught how to think for decades and decades. Now, what I'm afraid of is that we're starting to go down that road in the UK. I think people are now being nannied by big media, which is in the pocket of the big state. And big media is teaching you how to think. This is how you should look at racism. We'll give you 2 or 3 scenarios. Don't go beyond those parameters because you're really stupid. So we're going to show you how to think about racism. And what happens is you get to a situation which is so ludicrous now, is that white people in Britain do not have the right to talk about racism because they are the wrong color, which is why the opinion editor of the independent newspaper, they've got about half a dozen, one of those opinion editors was a black lady, who insulted me on Twitter and told me, basically, we're not looking for your kind of person to write opinion pieces for us. And that was amazing. That was a real eye-opener for me. That was basically a way of saying, you're not qualified to talk about racism. I wanted to publish an article about racism in German television that I worked for many years, and I experienced white-on-white racism, and I was basically cancelled and told to shut up and forget my idea and then blocked. And I think this is the problem we've got now, is that the way we have brainwashed people in the Middle East and Arab world, now elites in Europe and Britain are going along the same lines. And I think all of this policing of the internet is all part of it. I think, it's going to be very, very difficult in the coming years for people to really think freely and to express themselves freely, because they are now becoming zombies. And this is really, the whole Orwellian nightmare is actually coming true, unfortunately.
No, that's certainly right. Well, what I love about this program is you get some great academics who watch, who've written into us as well. So Edward Skidelsky, a philosopher at Exeter University and director of the Committee for Academic Freedom, which is a leading new free speech campaign group. He's written to me and talked about the open letter he's written to Bridget Phillipson, which he and 540 plus signatures to date, including academics from all disciplines and all types of university, including Richard Dawkins, Kathleen Stott, and also Lord Andrew Roberts. It's an open letter, which is basically saying how appalled they are about the refusal to implement this legislation, which has already received, as I say, royal assent, so it should be passed in law. The fact that this is not happening is appalling to a lot of people. We've got to be able to discuss this. Last word to you, George. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I don't have much to add. Look, but very simply, the governments of the UK, governments of the EU, the governments of NATO regard their enemy, not Russia, they regard their enemy as their own people, because they know their own people don't really buy into any of their agenda. They don't even buy into whether it's war against Russia and Ukraine. They don't buy into the Green New Deal. They don't buy into multiculturalism. They don't buy into mass immigration. And they're afraid that if they were to give them the power to actually implement their views of the world, then of course their power would be the power of these leaders, whether it's Starmer, whether it's Ursula von der Leyen or Thierry Breton, that would be challenged. So therefore they wage war against their peoples. And therefore they have to use the social media to wage war against their people, because what happens on social media, well, people start talking to one another. They start communicating their ideas, and those ideas are inimical to the ideas of these elites. So that's why it's so important for them to crack down on social media. They have to crack down on their enemies.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, they point out in this letter, they say it's an important piece of legislation. It's absolutely vital, they say, and academics and students of all persuasions need the protection afforded by the Freedom of Speech Act. It's clear that our freedom of speech and the rights that we have are being eroded, and we need to continue calling that out, which we will do here on the Muckrakers. I'll be back with you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Dr. George Szamuely, Martin J, always a pleasure to see you both. Thank you very much for joining me. Take care. We'll see you next time.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at tntradio.live.